There's something about untouched nature that calls to you, especially when you're young and eager to test your limits. Back then, I thought I was invincible. The idea of hiking through the dense forest was thrilling. When my friend, Leah, invited me to join her on a weekend hike, I didn't hesitate. She told me about a trail deep in the woods, one that few knew about. It wasn't on any map, she said, but a local had mentioned it to her in passing. Supposedly, it led to an old cabin that had been abandoned for years. Leah's excitement was infectious, and I found myself agreeing to go, despite the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut. Maybe it was the way she talked about the place, or perhaps it was something in the air, but I couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just another hike. The day came and we set off early, eager to reach the trail before noon. The forest was beautiful, the kind that felt alive with every step you took. But as we got deeper, the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers reaching for us. The further we went, the quieter it became, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. It wasn't long before we lost the trail. The path Leah swore existed was nowhere to be found. We wandered for hours, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking. Leah insisted we press on, convinced the cabin was just ahead. Then we found it, or rather, it found us. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its wood weathered and gray, almost blending with the surrounding trees. It was smaller than I'd imagined, with a roof that sagged in the middle and windows covered with thick layers of dust. Leah was ecstatic, her eyes shining with triumph as she approached the door. I hesitated, the feeling of unease growing stronger. Something about the place felt wrong, like we were intruding on something ancient and forgotten. But Leah wasn't one to back down. She pushed open the door, and we stepped inside. The air was musty, thick with the scent of rot and decay. The interior was sparse. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a flame in years. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. Whispers. Faint, almost imperceptible, but there. I glanced at Leah, but she didn't seem to notice. She was too busy exploring, oblivious to the soft murmurs that filled the room. As night fell, we decided to stay in the cabin. Leah was convinced it was too dangerous to find our way back in the dark, and I reluctantly agreed. We lit a small fire in the fireplace and sat down, trying to shake off the chill that had settled in our bones. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry. Accusing. I asked Leah if she could hear them, but she just looked at me like I was crazy. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers grew louder, filling my head with their incomprehensible words. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't even think. All I could do was listen as the whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all demanding something I couldn't understand. Then, in the middle of the night, I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see Leah, but she was fast asleep across the room, her back to me. The hand tightened its grip, and I felt a breath on my neck, cold and wet. The whispers turned into screams, loud and piercing, as if 100 voices were all crying out at once. I jumped up, pulling away from the invisible hand, and ran to the door. Leah woke up, startled, and asked what was wrong. I didn't answer. I just bolted out of the cabin, into the darkness of the forest. Leah chased after me, shouting for me to stop, but I couldn't. All I knew was that I had to get away from that place, from those voices. I ran blindly through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes, roots trying to trip me up, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I found myself back on a trail. Whether it was the same one we'd started on, I couldn't tell. I kept running until I collapsed from exhaustion, the whispers finally fading into the distance. Leah caught up with me, confused and scared. She hadn't heard the whispers or felt the hand. To her, it was just an old cabin, nothing more. But I knew better. We never talked about what happened that night. Leah avoided the topic, chalking it up to my imagination. But I knew it was real. The forest, the cabin, the whispers, they were all real. I haven't gone hiking since. The thought of stepping into a forest, of hearing those whispers again, fills me with a dread I can't shake. It's been years, but I still hear them sometimes. Late at night when the world is quiet. They're waiting, I think, for the day I return. And deep down, I know that if I ever do, I won't come back. There's a mountain in the range that doesn't exist on any map. Locals don't talk about it, and seasoned hikers dismiss it as a myth. But if you ask the right person in the right way, they'll tell you a story that chills your bones. They call it the Phantom Peak, a towering spire that appears only to those who are meant to climb it. I was one of those unlucky few. I've been hiking all my life, conquering some of the most challenging terrains across the world. The more remote and dangerous, the better. So when I heard whispers of a mountain that no one had summited, I was intrigued. A peak that supposedly didn't exist? It sounded like the ultimate challenge. The instructions were vague. Head into the mountains at dawn, follow the old forest road until it dead ends, and then keep walking. The peak will find you, the man told me with a strange smile. I didn't believe in the supernatural, but I was drawn to the mystery. It was a hike I couldn't resist. The day I set out was perfect. The sky was clear, the air crisp. I had all the supplies I needed, and my spirits were high. The first part of the journey was uneventful. I followed the forest road until it narrowed to a trail, and then to nothing but a line of beaten grass. Just as I was beginning to think the whole thing was a hoax, I saw it. A peak, jagged and towering, appeared through the morning mist. It wasn't on my map, but there it was, challenging me, daring me to reach its summit. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, like it was calling out to me. The trail that led up the mountain was steep and treacherous, barely visible, as if it had been forgotten by time. The trees around me grew twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. But I didn't care. All I could think about was the summit, that impossible peak that seemed to grow taller with every step I took. The hike quickly became more difficult than I'd anticipated. The trail was uneven, the rocks loose underfoot. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the sunlight, casting long shadows that twisted in the corners of my vision. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and the wind began to howl through the trees like a warning. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that made the hike hard. The path itself seemed to shift, the turns sharper, the inclines steeper. It was as if the mountain was playing with me, changing its shape to make the ascent more grueling. Every time I thought I was making progress, I'd reach a plateau only to find the peak further away than before. It was disorienting, like the mountain was alive, manipulating the landscape to keep me from reaching the top. But I was stubborn. I wasn't going to let a trick of the mind, or whatever was happening, stop me. I pressed on, pushing through the pain in my legs, ignoring the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was terribly wrong. I lost track of time. The sun seemed to set too quickly, the light fading into an unnatural twilight that turned the forest into a maze of shadows. The trail twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, doubling back on itself, leading me in circles. But every time I thought about turning back, I felt that pull again, stronger this time, urging me to continue. And so I did, climbing higher and higher, the peak always just out of reach. As I climbed, I began to notice things I hadn't before. Shapes in the mist, figures standing among the trees, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. At first, I thought they were other hikers, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't human. They were tall, their bodies unnaturally thin, their skin pale and translucent. They stood motionless, their heads tilted slightly as if listening to something only they could hear. Their eyes followed me, unblinking, their presence oppressive and suffocating. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it was hard. Their eyes bore into me, filling me with a deep, primal fear that I couldn't shake. The higher I climbed, the more of them there were, standing along the trail, emerging from the shadows, always watching. They never moved, never spoke, just stood there. Their presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone on this mountain. But there was something else too. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder the higher I climbed. It was a low, rhythmic thrum, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself, pulsing through the air, vibrating in my bones. The sound was hypnotic, pulling me deeper into the mountain's grasp, driving me forward despite the fear gnawing at my insides. I knew I should turn back, that this hike was nothing like I'd ever experienced before, but I couldn't. I was in too deep, too close to the peak to turn back now. After what felt like days of climbing, I finally saw it, the summit. It loomed above me, jagged and foreboding, the sky around it dark and swirling with clouds. The wind howled louder, the thrum vibrating through the air like a drumbeat, urging me to finish the climb. But the path to the summit was the most treacherous yet. The trail narrowed to a thin ledge, the drop-off on either side plunging into darkness. The rocks were slick with ice, the wind threatening to tear me from the mountain's side with every step. And yet, I kept going, driven by that insatiable need to reach the top, to conquer the mountain that wasn't supposed to exist. The silent watchers were gone now, but I could still feel their eyes on me, their presence heavy in the air. The summit was close, so close I could almost touch it. But as I took the final steps, the ground beneath me began to shake. The mountain rumbled, the thrum growing louder, almost deafening now, drowning out everything else. I reached the top, my breath ragged, my body exhausted. But instead of the sense of triumph I'd expected, there was only dread. The summit wasn't what I thought it would be. It was a barren, desolate place, the ground cracked and broken, the air thick with the smell of sulfur. In the center of the summit was a stone pedestal, ancient and weathered, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. And sitting on top of it was something I couldn't comprehend. A small, black orb, pulsing with a dark energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to go near it, but the mountain didn't give me a choice. The wind pushed me forward, the thrum shaking the ground beneath me, forcing me to the pedestal. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the orb, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the base of the mountain, lying on the ground where I'd started. The peak loomed above me, but it no longer held the same menacing presence. It was just a mountain now, solid and immovable, the mist that had obscured it before now completely gone. I sat up, disoriented and confused. My body ached, but I was unharmed. There were no silent watchers, no shifting paths, just the familiar forest and the sound of birds singing in the trees. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, some vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But then I looked down at my hand, the one that had touched the orb, and saw the faint outline of the symbol that had been on the pedestal, etched into my skin like a scar. It wasn't a dream. I had climbed the phantom peak and I had survived. Whatever force had been at work on that mountain had spared me, sending me back down to the base instead of trapping me in its endless ascent. I don't know why I was allowed to leave, why I was spared when so many others weren't. But I do know that I'll never return to that mountain. The symbol on my hand is a reminder of the danger I faced, a warning to never seek out the phantom peak again. I made it out alive and I'm grateful for that. But I'll never forget the terror of that climb, the feeling of being watched, the shifting path that tried to trap me. The mountain may have let me go, but I'll carry the memory of it with me forever. I used to be the kind of person who thrived on challenges. The steeper the mountain, the more excited I became. It was like I had something to prove to myself, that I could conquer anything. So when I heard about Mount Caliva, a peak notorious for its difficult climb, I knew I had to try it. I went alone, against the advice of friends who warned me about the unpredictable weather and treacherous terrain. But I wasn't worried. I had climbed higher and more dangerous mountains before. Mount Caliva was just another test of my endurance, another chance to prove my strength. The first day of the hike was beautiful. The air was crisp, the sky clear, I made good progress, the trail winding up the mountain through thick forests and rocky outcrops. There were no other hikers around, just me and the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel. It was peaceful, almost serene. But as the day wore on, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. I ignored it, determined to reach the next waypoint before nightfall. The trail grew steeper, the rocks slick with moisture as a fine mist began to descend. Visibility was low, but I kept going, confident in my skills. That was my first mistake. By the time I reached the halfway point, the storm had fully settled in. The wind was fierce, driving the rain into my face like needles. The trail had become treacherous, the ground turning to mud beneath my feet. I should have turned back. Every instinct told me to, but I was stubborn. I come too far to quit now. Besides, there was a small cave marked on my map, not too far ahead. I could take shelter there, wait out the storm, and continue in the morning. It took longer than expected to find the cave. The storm had turned the trail into a quagmire, and I kept slipping, each step a battle against the elements. When I finally stumbled into the cave, I was soaked to the bone, shivering from the cold. The cave was small, just big enough to provide shelter, with a narrow entrance and walls that closed in around me. But it was dry, and that was all that mattered. I set up my gear, trying to get warm, the sound of the storm raging outside. That's when I noticed something strange. The walls of the cave weren't natural. They were smooth, too smooth, like they'd been carved by human hands. I ran my fingers over the surface, feeling the cold stone beneath. There were markings, faint but unmistakable, etched into the rock in patterns that seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light of my headlamp. At first, I thought it was some kind of ancient writing, maybe left by the indigenous people who once lived in these mountains. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. The symbols didn't form words. They formed shapes, horrible, twisted shapes that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore the markings, convincing myself they were nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. I needed to sleep, but as I lay there, the storm still raging outside, I heard something that froze me in place. An echo, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the cave. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a rock shifting somewhere deeper inside. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, resonating through the walls, a deep, guttural noise that didn't belong in this world. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was getting closer, like something was moving through the cave, coming towards me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam barely penetrated the thick blackness beyond the entrance. Then I saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the light. It was massive, too large to be human, with a shape that defied description. It moved slowly, deliberately, the echo growing louder with each passing second. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the entrance, but there was nowhere to go. The cave was too small, too confined. I was trapped. The shadow moved closer, and I could feel it now, a cold, oppressive presence that seemed to suck the air from the room. The markings on the walls began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, as if responding to the creature's approach. I wanted to run, to flee into the storm, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming fear that gripped me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for the shadow to reach me. It felt like an eternity, the echo filling my ears, the glowing symbols burning into my mind. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The shadow receded, melting back into the darkness, and the markings faded, leaving me alone in the silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, huddled against the wall, too terrified to close my eyes, waiting for the shadow to return. But it didn't. The storm passed, and when the first light of dawn broke through the cave entrance, I finally moved. I packed my things as quickly as I could, desperate to get out of that cave, out of the mountain. My body ached, my muscles stiff from the cold and fear, but I didn't care. I had to leave. The descent was harder than the climb. The trail was still muddy, the rock slippery, but I didn't stop. I pushed on, driven by the need to put as much distance between myself and that cave as possible. When I finally reached the base of the mountain, I collapsed, my body giving out from exhaustion. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the peak, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I couldn't. There was no explanation, no rational reason for what I'd seen and heard. I've never gone back to Mount Caliva. I can't even look at it without feeling a chill run down my spine. The shadow, the echo, the glowing markings, they haunt my dreams, a constant reminder of that night. I've tried to forget, to move on, but it's impossible. The mountain left its mark on me, just like those symbols in the cave. And I know that whatever was in there, whatever ancient, dark thing that lurked in the shadows, is still waiting, biding its time. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear the echo again, low and rumbling, like a distant thunder. It calls to me, beckoning me to return to the mountain, to face the shadow once more. But I won't. I can't. Because deep down, I know that if I ever do, I won't make it back.